Hi there! Welcome to Pallet University and the next video in our Real Biologist Reacts series, reacting to the art of the wonderful Joshua Dunlop. Please make sure to go show Joshua all sorts of support to all of his links down in the description, his ArtStation page, which you see here, his YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, all of it. Go give him a follow and show him all sorts of support, because creative people in these troubling times need all the support that they can get. While you're down there, since you're already down there looking and showing Joshua all of your wonderful support, you should leave a thumbs up or maybe a thumbs down if you didn't like this video. And since you're already right there, the subscribe button's so close. It's so close to the thumbs up button. So you might as well click that as well to stay up to date and keep an eye out for any future videos on the channel. So today we are taking on the Beedrill line. If you missed the last video in this series where I talked about the Caterpie line, make sure to go check that out because there's going to be some similarities, but obviously between Beedrill and Butterfree, but they are vastly different groups of insects. And so if you want to get sort of a different perspective on some of the things I'm going to be talking about, please make sure to go check out that video as well. Anywho, Weedle. So firstly, I just really want to talk about how wildly different like the larvae of bees and like butterflies and moths are so incredibly different. And he does a good job with what he can. Obviously, he's not going to change, the whole body plan of Weedle to make it look more like a bee larva. But bee larvae do not really look like this. No, so bee larvae look a lot like grubs. They don't really even have eyes. They obviously do have like a mouth because that's the whole point of like honey is, bees make honey for a large variety of things. But one of those things is to manufacture food for the growing larva in the hive. So this is not really representative of what a true bee larva looks like, although Kakuna and Beedrill are pretty representative of what the pupa and adult form of bees look like. So we'll talk about Weedle. I wanted that context out of the way. So Weedle, I think, despite being a pretty ordinary Pokemon, I think is one of my favorite pieces of art that Joshua has done, because he changes it in ways that are subtle but make so much more sense. Because insects don't really have a true nose in the way that tetrapods do, in that this thing on its face here wouldn't just be a nose. So I'm really, really glad that Joshua decided to turn that into its mouth parts, and very complex mouth parts, which makes sense. Insects have very, very complex, feeding mechanisms. So all of, each of these pieces, except for maybe this big one, all these pieces move and do different things. So like these two parts here, probably move in a way that sort of scoop food into the mouth. And it's a very, very complex, like I said, each one of these little like sections or like plates type things move in a way that sort of crops food and eats food and pushes it into the mouth, which I think is super cool. He gave Weedle multiple eyes, which makes a lot of sense for a larva to have. Most larvae do have multiple eyes like that. Even if their adult form only has, one set of compound eyes like you see in Beedrill, but, we'll talk about Beedrill when we get there. He actually made it look hairy, and like I mentioned in the last video about when I was talking about Caterpie, almost all like moth or butterfly larvae do have some form of hair on them, and that's because for some it's actually for defense. Like, for example, I was out hiking back when I was in high school, so probably like 8-9 years ago now, and somehow I got a caterpillar, one of those fluffy white ones. And if you live in the Northeast and you've seen a fluffy white caterpillar, you probably know where this is going. But anyway, somehow it ended up on the back of my neck, and I don't know if at some point when we were sitting down, it like got on my shirt or something, because it was actually like just hanging out on like the collar of my shirt. But I kept like reaching back there and being like, man, the back of my neck is kind of itchy. So the next time we got to like a place where we were like stopping, taking a break, I took off because it wasn't just a shirt, it was like a sort of like an outer shirt with like a collar on it. So I took that off, and it was covered in these white hairs. And probably for the next 2 to 3 days, the back of my neck was red, itchy, and felt like it was on fire, because these hairs have little tiny barbs on them to serve as like a defense mechanism. So that is one use of what all of these hairs might possibly be for. But on Weedle, they look way too short. So to me, they look like they're probably just for sensing vibrations, which is, for the most part, what different hairs and things, like if you've seen like the hairs on a tarantula, that's what those do. Although those can also be sort of, flicked off and sort of thrown, because they're also very irritating if you breathe them in or get them in your eyes or something. But he actually gave it hair because, Weedle is the hairy bug Pokemon. But none of its, I don't even think any of its Pokedex entries mention it having hair, despite it being the hairy bug Pokemon. So, good job, Joshua. I approve. These legs are... So I also mentioned when talking about Caterpie that the way most like caterpillars work is that they have their legs in the front, then they have the like suction cup type things in the back. And that's sort of what Joshua did here, although I don't think, you can't see it from this angle, but I don't think there's any like suction cup stuff back here. But he actually turned these into proper legs. I don't know if there's actually supposed to be 4 on each side in like a proper insect larva. I would guess no. None that I have seen, but again, as I mentioned many times in the last video, insects are by far the most diverse group of animals, and so if you can think of some ecological role, an insect probably does that, short of being like a giant macro predator, because they don't do that anymore, but they used to. But so it wouldn't surprise me to hear that some insect larvae have, an extra set of legs compared to the adults. But I don't think that's very common if it does exist. But I like how he didn't just make them like the circular nubs, like you see in Weedle's actual art. So speaking of changing things from the actual art, the horn. So I think it's very uncommon for larvae to have like a horn proper like this. Some of them, I don't, again, it would not surprise me at all to hear, like nothing would surprise me if you're like, there's an insect that breathes fire. I'd be like, probably. So it wouldn't surprise me to hear that some insect larvae have like a venomous stinger. I don't know of any that do, but that, I'm not all that familiar with them. But this is how it would work. This is exactly how a bee stinger works. So a bee stinger is not just like a point that is always sticking out that they stab you with. That's not how bee stingers work. It's almost like, think of it sort of like a pen. So if you got a pen, but one that's like always clicked and you're like on the clicky end. So it's like as soon as there's a little pressure on it, the stinger comes out. So basically, this is showing the actual stinger out, which wouldn't be how a bee stinger would be, but it's like as soon as you would push down on the actual horn, so as if Weedle jabbed it into something, then the stinger would pop out and actually inject the venom. That is how bee stingers work, and I'm sure I'll talk about that when we get to Beedrill. But that is good job, Joshua. Instead of just making it so it's just a horn that is supposedly venomous, you actually gave it a mechanism for delivering the venom. 100% approve. Like I said, this is one of my favorite ones just because of all the simplistic changes that he made. And I would assume there's a similar needle mechanism on the tail stinger as well, but he doesn't show it. But yeah, so I think that's all I really want to talk about with Weedle. So let's move on to Kakuna. So, as I was mentioning last time when I was talking about Metapod, some larvae do have eyes. And while they can't really move, they can still sort of see what's going on around them. And bee larvae are an example of that. Bee larvae do have eyes. I don't think they're fully formed, but they're there. Many kinds of beetles also have eyes as well on their or pupae. I said larvae, I meant pupae. Yeah, like beetle pupae do commonly have eyes. Bee pupae commonly have eyes. And then in the original art, I think in Pokemon Red, I think they changed it in Pokemon Yellow. but at least in Pokemon Red, Kakuna's arms, so like these here, were actually like pointing out. They were not folded up against its body like they are here. They were like out. Which they're not out like that in bees, but they are very much still present here on the pupa. And that's super cool. That, you know, I always really enjoyed looking back on the bugs of Generation 1 because Masuda himself sort of came up with the idea of Pokemon because he is a very active bug collector. Maybe I'm confusing that with the other sort of like founder of Pokemon, but I think it's Masuda, one of the two. But he was a very avid bug collector. So it's really cool just to see the level of detail that they paid some of the bugs in Generation 1. And others like Caterpie, they just kind of didn't. But one thing with this is that bees do not make silk. Or some kind of web like this. Bees don't do that. Instead, basically, the like honeycomb structure of a beehive is like they'll lay an egg. The queen will lay a bunch of eggs, and either she lays them, one in each like cell, or after she just lays a bunch of them, the worker bees will sort of pick up an egg, put it in one of the cells of the honeycomb, and then just basically they have their own room until they become an adult bee. So they don't hang in the beehive or anything like this. They just sort of hang out as a larva in their cell in the honeycomb and just get fed honey and pollen and all sorts of good stuff. Then they turn into a pupa, and pupae don't eat. They're just kind of there biding their time until they develop into a fully grown adult. And so they don't hang like this, even though that is canon, at least from the anime. I don't think there's ever anything in the game other than that they learn String Shot that show Kakuna like hanging somewhere. But yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about Kakuna other than that it's literally just is a real bee larva or pupa. I keep doing that, pupa. That this is basically just what they look like. They might actually have a couple more legs other than the front ones. I think the front ones are mainly emphasized on Kakuna just because those are the ones that turn into Beedrill's drills. But I think they would have, I think these would be smaller, and then there'd be, you know, two other ones here for the other two sets of legs. But yeah, I think that's all I got for Kakuna, so let's move on to Beedrill. And, okay, so I was correct in the last video when I said that Beedrill does have the proper bug parts. That has a separate head, a thorax, and an abdomen. Whereas Butterfree just had the head, and then a thoracic abdomen? Thoracoabdomen? I don't... Because when you combine the thorax and the head, it becomes the cephalothorax. So would it be the thoracoabdomen? I don't think that there are any... That is actually something I'm fairly confident that no insect actually does. Or no arthropod even does. I mean, you can sort of argue... No, crabs don't even do that. Like, crustaceans don't do that. If anything, they combine... No, yeah, they have a cephalothorax as well. So, yeah, I don't know of any... like arthropod that combines the thorax and the abdomen instead of the head and the thorax. And I actually feel relatively confident in saying that, which is not typical for arthropods, because, like I said, there's an arthropod that does pretty much everything. Anyway, Beedrill. So, literally just a bee. Like, this is literally just what the head of a hornet looks like. That is literally just it. Like, you could Photoshop this onto the head of like a yellow jacket or something, and it'd look exactly the same. The eyes might be a different color, but everything else would be basically the same. So ants, I think, are one of the groups of pretty derived insects that actually keep both pairs of their wings that like as flight capable, because caterpillars are relatively basal for insects. The most basal, basically, how you can tell like a more derived insect from a more basal one is the most basal ones cannot fold their wings over their back. So you think of like a dragonfly, where its wings are either straight out or they are folded straight up. But they cannot fold them backward. Whereas things like beetles, their wings are always backwards because their first pair of wings, because all insects at some point had two sets of wings. The first set of wings is like the cover for their actual flight wings. And I think ants and bees, because they're quite closely related, do keep both pairs, but I don't actually know that. I'm going to look that up. Interesting. So it looks like ants do keep them fairly separate. Both bees and ants do still have both sets of wings, whereas bees sort of combine them almost like a butterfly does, where they're sort of fused together, whereas ants keep them pretty separate but still move them at the same time. Similar to like a dragonfly's wings. So, interesting. So Beedrill, and like you can see it right below me, but I don't have Beedrill on my screen right now, like the actual art of Beedrill. I would assume that Beedrill, I think Beedrill has both sets of wings in its art, but I don't know that for sure. Yeah, I really don't have much else to say, because Beedrill literally just is a bee, with the exception of it's missing a set of legs that should be probably like here. And obviously these. Like bees don't have that, obviously. So I would have liked to have seen him add some kind of stinger mechanism like he had on Weedle's head horn onto these, because that's how I would imagine that they work. Because for example, like the move Twin Needle, you know, Beedrill's signature move, is a bug type move that can poison. I believe it's the only bug type move that can inflict a poison status. So these must be venomous. And so I would have liked to have seen that. And then he shows this. So Beedrill itself sort of has, in its actual art, has the abdomen sort of end here, like kind of rounded off, and then a just big point here. Whereas he decided to sort of just make the abdomen taper at the end, and then have a bee-like stinger here, which makes more sense than just having like a big pointy thing at the end. Yeah, and as far as I know, these look relatively like the end of bee legs. Having them jointed the way they are, though, makes them seem pretty anthropomorphic. Because these look fairly like vertebrate proportions, whereas like this would be like your femur, this would be like your shin, your tibia and fibula, and then on something like a horse, for example, this would be your the equivalent of like these bones in your hand. That section would be like these bones in your hand, your fingers, and then this would be like your last finger in the last bone in your finger. So that's sort of what that looks like to me. That's a little bit of a stretch to call it anthropomorphic, I guess. But in Beedrill's art, Beedrill is basically just an anthropomorphized bee with, you know, pointy hands. Yeah, again, like if I were to see a bee with like sharp, you know, first legs, I'd believe that. Bees are designed to just literally murder things. Murder hornets. But overall, I think Beedrill was done super, super well. And this entire line, I think, is overall one of my favorites, just design-wise, because they make sense. You know, they look like they could be actual animals living in the real world, which I think is the whole point of this whole series of art by Joshua, is to make Pokemon seem like real, living things that could exist in our world. And with this line, he did an excellent job of it. So yeah, that's going to end it off. Please, please, please go show Joshua all sorts of support, and all of his social links down below, like I said at the beginning. Make sure to follow me on Twitter as well at Pallet_U to keep up on all things Pokemon science. And if you feel like our content is worthy of supporting financially, we do have a Patreon account, the link to which will be down in the description also. Massive, massive, massive shout out to our supporter over on Patreon, Patty Murphy. You rock, you're the best. And lastly, thank you so much for watching, and as always, there's a time and place for everything.